Please join me in welcoming them here tonight.
Oh, thank you. Well, I'll make it clear, I am simply the straw that stirs the drink tonight, so I will quickly get out of the way. Why they call on me, I have some familiarity. I know Jasmine. I get out to Healdsburg, and so here I am, and really pleased to present to you an incredible story. This is a story of patience and perseverance that transcends wine. This story could apply to any great endeavor, but David's decided to do this with wine, so hallelujah, we've got great stuff to drink tonight. And we're going to go through some of the reasons he ended up doing what he did. We can have some questions, put up your hands and ask. This is meant to be informal, and I think you'll find it most entertaining and educational. Well, David, I love your attitude. You said the most important principle is how the wine goes down your throat. And if we start with that, how in the world did you get from the clothing industry to growing and producing some of the great wines in America?
I think am I wired up here? Hello, everybody. Can you hear me okay?
Welcome.
Great. Well, thank you. And Jasmine and I are very grateful for the honor of being invited and having this opportunity to discuss our site and what's happened over the last 40 years there. So as far as the clothing business, that was just an excuse to grow more and better wine, because my first experience of wine when I was about 5 was passing out during the Passover Seder, and from too much Mogen David, And I think other than sacramental purposes, there was nobody in the room that drank wine at all. So obviously it was genetic, and I started in the 70s, seriously, late 60s, 70s, and had the good fortune to meet an amazing importer in San Francisco who at that time had the best catalog of European wines. He was an early investor in Chalon, which was one of the, along with Mount Eden that we're going to have tonight. Chalon was a serious endeavor to try to determine if good Pinot could be grown in California. So, and he introduced me to the growers and producers in Europe. In those days, you got a written letter of introduction that you presented at your destination, and then the door would open, and you were allowed to enter. So that's really how I got going, and to misquote Bob Dylan, I started off with Bordeaux, and then hit the harder stuff. I'll tell you a little anecdote about Bordeaux and Burgundy, and I'm pointing at this from an inclusive point of view. They're both amazing. But Bert Williams told me that he had some old, distinguished enneophile from France visit him. And at one point, Bert said, "Now, how would you define the difference between Bordeaux and Bourgogne?" And the old gentleman says, "Bordeaux. Bourgogne." So I kind of like the circle stuff. So and it's a good image. The guy was probably from Burgundy, but the thing about a circle is that there's no corners, and the amazing thing about Pinot, and to a certain extent Chardonnay, is that they're so open to the environment, and they're open to your palate. Now, I was telling Temple about, in my opinion, the whole sequence of wine production doesn't end in the winery. It ends when we pick up the glass and sip or gulp the liquid down. You're as much a part of the production as Jasmine or myself or the fellows working in the vineyards. So anyway, that's kind of gives you the sense of how I got motivated in all this. And along the way, I was a trader. I'll tell you another interesting story about my background and being open to all this stuff. Is that my partner was a interesting woman from Libertyville, Illinois, and she came from a pretty affluent background, but she kind of defined neurosis, and she had a peculiar personality, and she had a friend who was even more weirder. And listen to this: these two biddies in 1971, I want to say, got in a Land Rover in Paris, the two of them. And like I'm giving you this little jocular background because they were not what you would call, totally competent people. They drove to New Delhi. Yep. They went through territory that our special forces would have a hard time getting through today. And telecommunications didn't work too well in those days, so you get a phone call and you had to scream into the phone to provide enough energy, for the power. And so that every now and then we talk, and I said, "Hey, you guys okay? How's it going?" He said, "Oh, everything's fine, except we had a big problem in the last town. This guy ripped us off when we were trying to buy some hash." That was their difficulty. So anyway, I don't know if I answered your question, but that's kind of how I got into the whole thing.
So you're interested in wine. Now, at that point, everybody was rushing into Napa. Everybody was rushing into East Sonoma County, around Sonoma and Healdsburg. Why in the world did you go to West County?
Well, I don't have really an answer for that. I showed up in California, and I think the first time was '63 or '4, and I went down the coast to see some relatives in L.A. But I started in San Francisco, and I settled there permanently in '68. And for my whole time in California, I've always lived in the second ridge from the ocean in the redwood rainforest. Somebody pointed that out to me. I hadn't realized it. And I think that I was just drawn there. I mean, even growing up in New York, I always went out to the woods and, camped out and stuff. But I think in the mid-'70s, I could see California was sliding seriously downhill. So I wanted to buy a piece of land that I could kind of hide out in. And I looked all over, and I was up in Idaho and Oregon and Northern California, and finally I found this ranch, sheep ranch. And I realized years later that it found me. I think that's really how I wound up there. And while I was a fervent wine drinker, appreciator, I had absolutely zero impetus or background in growing. But somebody once said, in the whole universe, there are no accidents, absolutely no accidents. So my drinking buddy in the Santa Cruz Mountains was a guy named Jim Beauregard, great grower. And unfortunately, his destiny was sort of undermined that his family owned the specialty supermarket in town in Santa Cruz. So he never got to devote himself full time to grape growing, but he's incredible. So I bought this 1,000-acre sheep ranch in '78, and it was $400. I bought it in two pieces. It cost $400,000. We had an appraiser out last year who told me that a neighboring vineyard 2 miles away was appraised. The developed vineyards, it's fairly fairly high, renowned Pinot vineyard. And per acre was appraised at 190,000 planted. So basically 2 acres of our developed vineyard today are worth what in 78 the whole place was worth. So, it was like, and then there was no, the government didn't show, we had no rules and regulations, so we didn't have to go through all those hoops, and, we could be creative and develop things. So Beauregard, get back to Jim here, he came up in 1980 to see this wild piece of land I bought, and the sheep were milling around. He said, "You plant Pinot here, and this will be a famous vineyard." It's like, Jim. And then he brought 1,000 self-rooted. Now, these are vines that have no resistance to soil-borne pests like phylloxera. So we put this 1,000 vines of Pomard in, and we called it the Old Vineyard. And you're going to get to sample the Old Vineyard, still producing. And neighboring vines that were planted to a rootstock that lost its immunity to phylloxera lasted 5 years. These vines are like 100 yards away from the Old Vineyard. It was an old Indian site, and I guess it had been a dump for 500,000 years, who knows. So the ground was so fertile that the roots could keep regenerating itself. So that was the beginning. In 1980, Jim got me to plant these 3 acres. The other 2 were Riesling, which were on rootstock. I figured out in 10 years that Riesling wasn't going to do well there. Plus, had no market, so we took that out and converted it to another clone of Pinot, which we'll discuss later. But that was really how it happened. And from 1980 to 88, I was seriously in the clothing business and had the great fortune to make some money, so I was able to lose it all growing grapes and making fine wine. Yeah, that's what they say, the best way to turn a big fortune into a small fortune is to grow premium grapes.
I think what he's understating is how remote this place is. Temple and I know we've been up in there for different reasons. I remember the first time I went up there, we're in Cazadero, and this woman came out missing her teeth and a bony finger and pointed down to us and said, "If you go up there, you'll die." and unless you've been there, I mean, it's like, whoa. And you go, and there's nobody, and there's no power lines, and no leaf blowers, and no cars, and no people. It is very, very remote. And so that begs the question, David, how do you get people and electricity and phone service, all that? It's really off the grid.
You build it, and they will come. What's really wonderful about that is that, especially for Jasmine running the winery now from top to bottom, getting, there's no pool, large pool of qualified labor. But what we find is that the site is so unique, just like it pulled me to it in some way that nobody could possibly describe. The people that come there, want to be there. And slowly, we've opened our ears and listened to what the site, what's compatible with it, I guess is the best way to put it. For example, our biodynamic farming. And we've slowly shed ourselves of all the abstract ideas, concepts that we would have that what would contribute to high-quality viticulture and winemaking, and allow the soil, the plants, the weather, the must, the wine being made to tell us what's required. I mean, it's really a very interesting dance. It's a true exercise in consonance. And I think, going back to Burgundy, for example, I mean, give us 300, 400, 500 years, and maybe I could sit here then and tell you we figured it out, At which point lightning would probably strike, Yeah.
Should let's segue into drinking the old?
Yeah,
We're going left or right?
Yeah, the Old Vineyard is the first stop on the left.
Well, y'all
Yeah.
pour that, and while we're talking. Now, David, you're not a geologist, I know, but tell us what's going on up there. Rock, clay, limestone. What's the nature of where you planted these first grapes?
The site is. I wish I could find a word that was more uncertain than problematic. Because it's you really learn to live with uncertainty up there. Just to kind of draw a picture of it, we have a field we call number 12. We're not very imaginative when it comes to these names. And that was developed in 2002, at which point we had realized that we better pay attention to the soils. And it's 5.5 acres, and from serious soil surveying with very competent agronomists, soil folks, it wound up being divided into 9 discrete blocks, each with its own rootstock and clone and method of farming. The primary soils are clay soils with different admixtures of loam and sand. But because we're in the redwood forest and we're sitting on the San Andreas Fault, which for 30 million years has been lifting and folding and crushing and doing it's like a mix master down there. The formations are highly varied. And then lo and behold, the Europeans showed up around 1850 and began cutting the trees. It's mostly redwood and fir, and sheep farming, sheep grazing. And we're getting, I think in those days it was more averaging over 100 inches of rain a year. Now we're down to 60 or 80. So the combination of clear cutting, and especially it started in 1906 with the great earthquake. So the wood was used for rebuilding San Francisco. And the overgrazing by the sheep, the lack of conservation in logging, and the rain just took all the topsoil away. So we're sitting on a ridge. Most of the land is steeper than 50% slope, so you can't farm it. And so the topsoil all went downhill, in which case, if it hadn't, we wouldn't be growing quality wine grapes. We'd be growing strawberries or something, row crops. And so that's pretty much it. It's a very varied site, and the test of farming it really has to do with understanding the soils as much as anything else about typical plant management.
Well, you mentioned strawberry. I get strawberry on the nose with this one. Jasmine, how would you typify?
I was told to be prepared for questions, so well, when over the years we sold fruit to so many different winemakers, and one of the favorite tastings that we've been invited to do is the horizontal, so the Hirsch vineyard designates from Lily Spelling, Little Eye, Pisco, Fela. And I always remember my father being asked, what are the primary taste units of Hirsch? And he would never say, Dad, cherries or strawberries or peaches or anything like that. He would always say tannin. That the hallmark of our wines is the tannin that comes from the site and is probably deeply connected to this lack of topsoil that we have on the Hirsch site. And for me, the Old Vineyard is this wonderful combination of rigor coming from the tannin, but it has so much of that. There are burgundy joy as well in the fruit, the concentration is so lovely. So I think for me it's that it's like very classic, again,
David, you had a real power group in the early days. Burt Williams from Williams Salem, and Steve Kistler was there, and Ted Lemon from Literai. It sounds like you guys worked together and brought this forward. It's fascinating. What was the association like?
Yeah,
Competitive or collaborative or?
No, not competitive. It's sort of like if you have 6 folks on a boat that's shipping water in the middle of the Pacific. Probably a good idea to be collaborative, No, I mean, we started in 1994. That's what I mean about the power of a place or an event to draw you. I was selling to Kendall Jackson, Stone Street, and a neighbor had been buying the fruit from the 80s, and then like in January and February of '94, the phone rang, and there was Ed Sellium from William Sellium, Mark Bixler, Steve's partner at Kistler, and Ted Lemon all called me up within a month or so. And they had heard that the Sonoma Coast, the far Sonoma Coast was something to be paying attention to. And you can't imagine, like in the 1980, what it was like to go out there. If it rained a lot, you couldn't get into the ranch. And it was all sheep, and the sheep was everywhere. I think there were 5 livestock gates from where the pavement ended. It's about 2.5 miles to the ranch from there. You had to go through 5 gates, and the wind can blow. I remember we called the Seafeld Gate. It was some guy that used to, family that owned a bunch of land there, and it was right in a gap. And in those days, we made these big wooden gates, and the wind would blow. You couldn't close the gate. We're going the other way. The gate would blow you open down into the gully. It was primitive. So, out of that, we have a neighbor, the Bohans. They actually had the first vineyards out there, and they fortunately they were like loggers and sheep guys, and Mick Bohan, the old man, had gotten the idea. He had grown up in Cazadero. He remembered before Prohibition there had been vineyards in that country. And he went down to the, Corbel that makes the sparkling wine. They used to make, their main product was brandy in the day. So they had a package store, and Mick went down there and said, what wines sell the best here? And fortunately, they mentioned Burgundy, because no one called it Pinot Noir in those days. And he got some cuttings from some guy in a nursery down in Fresno and put in this Burgundy. And in 1981, I think he planted it in the late 60s, early 70s, these neighbors of mine, it was called Sea Ridge Winery, 2 marine biologists who were making wine without electricity out there. The Sea Ridge Bohan got a gold medal or a big medal at the Sonoma Harvest Fair. And that was the first indication that maybe something was happening out there. And that was all that was there. There was really nothing,
Let's move on to this Mount Eden. Now, that's a classic. And maybe you can tell us a story about cuttings and where Mount Eden came from and how it ended up on your property.
Yeah. My buddy Jeffrey Patterson there, yeah. So, what year is this one? 16, that's right, Lindsay. Yeah, there was when I shook the moths out of my cloak from the clothing business, I decided to move up permanently to the ranch in '88 and start planting new vineyards. And I'd made a deal with a guy in the Santa Cruz Mountains to get his budwood, because I loved his wine. It was called Santa Cruz Mountain Winery. But there had been a drought in that country then, and the budwood wasn't usable. So once again, it was my friend Jim Beauregard said, go to Mount Eden. and talk to Jeffrey. And I happened to show up just when he had opened an amazing bottle of his wine for a client from Seattle. And I tasted and I said, I want, sell me your Budwood. And he tried to talk me out of it because it's highly virused. It has this leaf roll virus. And difficult to farm, low yields. He eventually ripped out his old vines. However, what I hadn't realized then was that these were vines that had been brought from Burgundy in 1900 by Paul Masson and planted in Saratoga, which is, right next to San Jose, and up in the mountain, up in the hills. And then Martin Ray, who started Mount Eden in the 40s, had taken cuttings from Masson, and these were those vines. So we have those cuttings. So like we're 3 generations away from Burgundy. 100 years later. It was 1989. I took the cuttings, and we're really blessed with having an extraordinary vineyard manager. And once again, another example of the site drawing people to it that are compatible with it. Everardo showed up as a teenager in 1989 to help bud the Riesling over to Mount Eden, and he never left. And I don't, perhaps you're aware that in the Mexican culture it's very collective. You don't have a lot of loners coming out of that society. And Everardo has just flourished there. I mean, he got married in a year or two, and they've had 4 kids, but they live right there. And the older boys have been working on the ranch, and he's been able to take this heavily virused field, which we're going to taste in Westridge soon, and by selecting out the healthier vines and planting those cuttings in another field, we have a problem now with our Mount Eden that it overproduces. We have to cut it back. And Jeffrey Patterson from Mount Eden came up to visit 5-6 years ago and was shocked to see that we had a seriously green harvest those vines. Not the original ones we planted, but yes. Yes, I think it's interesting about Pinot that probably more so than other varieties that this is sort of a concept that comes out of biodynamics, that for each variety, each species of plant, there's always a master plant. There's like the earth tree, the fir or the rose bush. It kind of, as long as that plant is healthy and flourishing, then all of the millions of other plants will be good. And I think with Pinot, there's some place or other, perhaps in imagination, the master Pinot plant. So wherever Pinot is grown all over the world, it's like one big forest of Pinot, one big field of Pinot. So we're all related that way.
So this is what the rootstock is different than what's above the ground. Can you explain how that works?
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
And it's the same as in most fruit trees that, over the years, the botanists have developed rootstock, in terms of grapevines out of necessity because of phylloxera, that are resistant to soil-borne pathogens. So what you basically do is graft the clone, the variety that you're interested in, to the rootstock, and then you don't have to worry about disease infestation from the soil. Of course, I'm sure most of you know that somebody brought American grapevines to Europe, and because the native vines in North America had built up immunity to phylloxera, but the European ones hadn't. The European vineyards were decimated within 20 years and it was amazing. It was talk about a contagion. So that's when the botanists got serious about developing resistant rootstocks.
The Mount Eden's a serious peanut. I mean, the mouthfeel, everything is just right there. So. Breakfast, lunch, dinner.
Now what Jeffrey does is incredible, and like, I mean, they're on the San Andreas too. They're close to it, and it's like you go up there, it's a completely different world than us. You know, like it's like the moon to Mars. You know, it's like, yeah.
I mean, you're so far. I remember talking to somebody up there. They don't live up there. The families, they live down in Santa Rosa because there's no schools or anything. The Robledos homeschool their kids, or how do they?
Oh, no, we have a school. We have a one-room schoolhouse, so to speak. You know, I think the enrollment's down to 32 or something now. Oh, Jasmine went to that school for a year. That was great. I mean, no, the people coming out of that school have had, a lot of them have gone on to really successful lives and careers. But then, you know, the underline what you were saying is that it's kindergarten through 8, and then when they go to high school, it's like a 3-hour round trip bus trip to the high school. You know, it's kind of nuts. So yeah, the Robledos actually for their 2 younger kids, they rented a house in Forestville, down in the Russian River, so the kids could go to all the extracurricular activities. And yeah, Martha's not one of the great drivers, so she's a lot more comfortable not having to make that run you do on your bike.
I
Yeah.
have a question. How did the first vineyard plantings develop into kind of all of these blocks that you have? How did they kind of diversify that?
I mean, what was a plan for
Yeah.
going from the old vineyard one by one to the other blocks? Well, you know, the first priority was topography.
Yeah.
You know, out of this 1,000 acres, I think if we pushed it, we could probably plant maybe 100 acres in vines, and maybe another 20 or 30 in olive trees, and that's about it. Everything else is too steep or too infertile. So we just started on the ridges. And obviously we have an east ridge, a west ridge, and then we have it's like a U. Then the base of it, which includes the Ration Ridge. But then as far as the plant selection, obviously I was enamored with Mount Eden and the old vineyard block. You know, in 1980 nobody really cared that much about clones, and so I think it was 15 years until I asked Jim, where'd you get that plant material that we put in the old vineyard? And he didn't really remember. But there's an extraordinary woman named Lucy Morton, who's our foremost amphiologist. Yeah, identification of plants by basically leaf shape, you know, and configuration. And she's an extraordinary person. And she thinks that it's Pomard 4 and Vadensville mixed. And she said in the mid-'70s, the Oregon nurseries, Jim remembered getting it from Oregon, they had mixed those two up in the propagation in the nurseries. Yeah, so we planted a lot of Pomard. And then I think it was Steve Kistler got me going on the Swan clone. And, you know, I was very interested in the heritage. So our Swan came from Joe Swan through Dalinger, who's next door to Kistler. And then Steve got it from Dalinger, and I got it from Steve. And then I got Calera from Ted Lemon. So that was pretty much we have 2 of the Dijon clones. We have 777, which came from Steve, and 114, because I'm sort of afraid of Davis and the genetic, the kind of factory propagation. And so we got the 114 from a vineyard up in Oregon, southern Oregon, that had suitcased it from Burgundy. And I want to underline that. I'm not being smart, but the reason I wanted to stay away from the Dijon clones, the genetically selected ones, is that the beauty of these wines, what makes them so tantalizing, is that they're a combination of wonderful things and ugly things. They're like life. And if life was just perfect all the time, we'd all be zombies. We'd all be dead. I mean, really, life is the beautiful combination of suffering and relief and pleasure. And the person that has a great life is the person that learns how to walk through it without being affected too much by either one. Not too difficult. So, Pinot, you want to have as much complexity and weirdness as possible. But then you go. I think that the farming and the winemaking is 10%. It's all about the site and maybe the plants you selected for the site. And the worst thing you can do as a wine grower is to try to manipulate what the site and the plants offer you.
Yeah. So let's look at the East Ridge. What's over there? Is it rock, clay, loam? What makes it different than the side?
The East Ridge is a little bit more clay driven, has a little bit less gravel and rock. A little bit steeper. One of the things that's very difficult in general in California with the Burgundian varieties, Pinot and Chardonnay, is that we're a little bit too tropical. We're at 38 degrees north latitude. We're on the same latitude as Lisbon. Not that we're hot as Lisbon maybe, but the import of that is in the ripening time, the sun is too high in the sky, relatively speaking. I think Burgundy is around 45 degrees north, about the same as Oregon maybe. So what we really want at ripening is light. That's really the way to extract out of the berries the most complexity of acidity and retard the sugaring of the fruit. So that's sort of what Jasmine was pointing out. That you have a wine that is able to be a lens into the site because all the constituent elements are in balance, have fully matured. Kind of like a person. Somebody who's not one-sided, been able to develop, his or her masculine and feminine sides, creative sides, analytic sides. Somebody you could spend a day talking to, as opposed to some one-sided person that you, in 10 minutes, you've got the whole story. We don't want the whole story here. And Isra is a good example of a good story.
But it's such a struggle between being too vegetal and yet being ripe and homogeneous. How many, in terms of picking the grapes and the brick scales, how many days do you have to make those critical decisions?
None.
None.
No, that's. I think, and Jasmine, you should jump in here, but because you're making these decisions now. But it's so intuitive, especially at our site where you have 96 different microsites that you're trying to. What did you have this year? 80. 80 separate blends. 80. Fermentation lots. I mean, some of which are in 200-gallon bins. And some are in 5-ton tanks. But to try to pick the right harvest date, it's you just can't analyze it. You really, I think the best method I've come up with is to taste the. We go around and pick get a bunch of fruit, crush it, and taste the juice. It's grape juice. You really can't taste the wine through that, but you can kind of intuit when it's ready. And that's really, I think the best you can do, at least as far as I've gotten to. What do you?
Rob, David, it's easy to see why the site found you initially, but walk us through a little bit about the whole decision about deciding to become a grape farmer first, and who was the first person to make grapes from your vineyards, and secondly, at what point did you decide to make that change and say we want to produce our own wine?
Oh, okay. What was the first part of your question? I'm sorry.
Who was the first person to produce grapes from your?
Produce wines, you mean? You mean wines?
Yeah.
Oh, no, produce wine from your vineyard.
Oh, okay.
You had planted.
Well, those neighbors at Sea Ridge, yeah, they made some Pinot from there, and they made some Riesling. We have a couple of bottles of Riesling.
Sorry, I got confused. It was from your vineyard. It wasn't from theirs.
Yeah, it was from the 3 acres we planted in the old vineyard. Yeah, yeah. But I'm sorry,
as far as what made you decide to transition?
Oh, the transition.
Letting people make wine from your grapes versus making your own wine.
I have a little aphorism about that. The wealth is in the ground and the cash is in the bottle. So I hate to say, I hate to come on in a material way, but
We who buy wine understand that quite.
yeah. But the other thing was the question had come up about collaboration with our first clients, and by the end of the '90s, we'd kind of exhausted what they were able to contribute, in terms of viticulture. And Everard and I thought that if we had a winery right in the middle of the lot of the field, we would get immediate feedback into the viticulture, and that's really worked out. It's really been and I think what Jasmine and I are trying to do is create a seamless production of where you don't have fruit growing on one side and wine making on the other. That it's like a river, it just flows right down to to its mouth. It starts in the hills, just kind of seamlessly flows through. And the great gift that we have from William Sellium, Kistler, Littori, is that by the end of the '90s, the vineyard was pretty well known. So I thought, if we started a small winery, people would know who we were. And we'd have a nice reception.
1998, you had some challenges. Would you tell us about the rain that year?
Oh yeah, the Chinese water torture. I think it started in October and ended in June, 150 inches. And it wasn't these, sometimes we can get these gully washes, we call them, or rain 8-9 inches in a day, or 20 inches in a week or something. We had these big floods a year ago. Was it a year ago or 2 years ago? And wiped out the Russian River. But this '98, it just dripped. It just kind of rained for 9 months, 8 months. I use the Chinese water torture, concretely, because I thought I was going to go nuts. That I had to get out of there. So what happened is, in the West Ridge field, which we had planted without any attention to agronomy, it was a bad rootstock for that field and a terrible. The Mount Eden was the worst thing to put in there without paying attention to the soil. So the soil was super saturated for 5-6 months, and all of the fine roots mildewed, rotted away, and the vines had when it finally dried out, they had no way of sourcing nutrient. So they almost died. We were going to take it out. And here's an example of the secret to life, you might call it, of converting a problem into an opportunity. At the last moment, we decided to keep it and see if we, at least for educational purpose, we couldn't learn something from trying to restore it. And what we learned was turning it into a field that could produce world-class wines. That's really what happened. And it turned me into an amateur agronomist. Yeah, that had been endemic in California, that farmers were always looking up. It must be those beautiful skies and all that sun, and not paying attention like our European compatriots to what's underneath the ground.
You know, it's kind of like photography. They're great photographers and they're great printers, and rarely is there anybody can do all that. Ansel Adams comes to mind, and I think you guys are kind of the Ansel Adams of wine. I mean, you bridge that gap. We've talked about the land where you are, so let's shift and talk about the people who make your wine. I see we've got a 2012 William Salem. I guess Bob Cabal would have made that.
Yep.
Was Bob had done? Yeah. So what influence do you think he had in making your 2012?
That's a tasking question. The signature of William Salem, you know, those of you who are familiar with the wines, is that even back to Bert, but maybe it became a little bit more significant after 97 when Bert, the last year, is that the wines seem to are more adhere to a winery signature. You know, that there's as opposed to a dedication to a sense of place, it's more a sense of their expression of what William Salem stands for. So now when you have their Rocchioli or Farrington or Precious Mountain or Hirsch, you know, the wines definitely are not homogeneous. But the winemaking there, I think, has tended more to a house style.
More pretty forward.
Yeah, and they always picked a little later than us, so the wines are a little bit more alcoholic than ours, especially after Jasmine and Raj introduced the In Pursuit of Balance. You know, the expression of Pinot at lower alcohol. You know, I think that amplified the spectrum of the sight in your glass. You know, I think it makes the wines younger. You know, how, if we think of our children, how open they are when they're young, and then like us adults, they get more and more conditioned, less multifaceted. So I think the wine at lower alcohol, within reason, of course, within balance, has that aspect of being multifaceted. Lets the sight come through more clearly.
David Cobb, a friend of mine, Ross Cobb, comes to you guys later. Did he pull you back from that over-extracted style? What was Ross's role, and he was there for several years. I'm correct. What did he? How did he steer Hirsch?
You know, Ross was a fish that Jasmine hooked. So I'm going to let Jasmine talk about Ross.
Well, I started working for my dad in '08 and was not enamored of the Riker style, which was more our style. And I think that our wines between 2002 and 2008 were more, yeah, they were picked a little bit later. Still made with the same principles with non-intervention, no filtration, no farming, but they were picked at a higher risk level. And personally, from a stylistic point of view, I didn't care for that style. And I also felt, and I think that Dad and I discovered over the next few years, when we tried picking, we have so many blocks, so the opportunity to try different things, we can really experiment, and we can try out picking block 8, pick part of it today, and part of it 5 years later, and really see what's the difference in the expression of the vineyard with an additional 5 days of ripeness. And as my father indicated, 5 days is a long time during harvest. And so in 2009, I really advocated to pick earlier, and we picked some blocks early, picked some blocks with the same kind of ripeness paradigm. And then at the end of harvest, Ross, who had been a long time winemaker at Flowers, and really became our close neighbor, when he was at Flowers, he would come to dinner. He's a family friend. I mean, my stepmother jokes that she's met 8 of his girlfriends because he had come to dinner so many times. He's married now, I shouldn't say, but Ross had become a really close friend and someone we trusted, and Dad even consulted Ross when we built the winery. But Ross had left Flowers and taken a job somewhere else, and he called me after the 2008 harvest, or 2009 harvest, to say he was unhappy in his new job, and if I had heard of any opportunities that I should call him. So I put on the phone, and I called my father, and I said, Ross Cobb's on the market. We should call him. And Mark, our winemaker at the time, was amazing, and he'd been with us for a long time, and the religion was running its course, and it was feeling like the right time. And we were curious about this style that Ross was showcasing through his own wine, through the Cobb wine. And so Dad called him, and a few months later, we were very lucky to get to work with him. So he started with us in January of 2010. 2010 was his first visit with us. And I think, to your question about the ripeness and what my father said, excessive ripeness is a homogenizer. And for those of us that love Pinot Noir, we love it because it shows sight. And what is sight if not distinction, uniqueness? So we have 60 sites, and we need to understand them. So we have to find a style that serves the higher intention, which is the intention that is really above that. Style should be the service to the wine, service to the pursuit of terroir. So for us, we feel that the slightly more restrained approach to ripeness allows the vineyard to shine. And Ross really helped us find that path.
I know in East Sonoma and Napa, they're in panic mode. I mean, they're picking, a month earlier than they used to because of climate change. Are you somewhat insulated from that because of the marine effect?
I don't know. We're I don't think it's gotten any hotter, really. We did have a terribly hot year in 2017, but we've had that before. I would say the trend, even before we started picking lower bricks, has been to pick a little bit earlier. So I guess it must be warmer. There's some strange things going on with the weather on the coast. Our nighttime temperatures have been higher than they normally had been, and that's been consistent. Well, whether the year is cool or warm. But I don't know if you know this. There's a lot of talk about climate change, but the the best records we have, as far as I know, of weather over the last 1,000 years comes through vineyards, through winemaking, because the monks especially kept really good records. And then the climatologists or whoever have been able to go back and put these together. And, there's been, I think the cycle is generally around 90 years. There have been extreme swings in weather. We're all familiar with Charles Dickens. Well, the reason the motivation for writing a lot of those books about the suffering in London in the early 19th century was because the weather, there was like decades and decades of extremely cold weather. It was snowing in London in the summertime. And then there were years of heat, sustained heat. So I'm not sure. I think it's indisputable that man has put a tremendous amount of pollutants into the atmosphere. So I don't think we can argue with that. But these cycles are not year to year, and so I think to really answer that question is really difficult in the short range. But on the other hand, it'd probably be a good idea to be prepared for the raid before the raiders come. So we are, especially at Jasmine's urging, we are thinking about sustained periods of hotter weather. Yeah.
You've chosen biodynamics for your vineyard. Maybe you could say a few words about that. And my question would be, why did you choose biodynamic over organic?
Well, once again, it was, like going back to '98. Really was the year in which our attention really turned to the site. And then when we built the winery in '02, we started making wine in '02, and began to integrate the viticulture and the winemaking. It became clearer and clearer to us that all of the answers lay around us. For example, in the '90s, we had several consultants that would help us with the farming. And then they were all very competent people, but they brought a more or less generic approach. And since we were beginning to find out that our place was not just unique because it was different, but it was unique because it was exceptionally different. One of the key things that's fascinating about our place is the ocean. We're up on a ridge, say 1,500 feet. You can see the ocean 2.5 miles away. Who's that guy? How did he get in the room? And then we have these beautiful places there. You just go out. I still do it after all these years, where you sit in the redwoods. You're looking at the vineyards flowing down toward the ocean, and we're surrounded by rivers, because the ridge, the San Andreas, has thrust this piece up, and the softer geology is all eroded away over the eons. And then you look to King Ridge Road that you bicycled on, and you're looking across what we call the Badlands, that the whole environment changes completely when you get about 4 or 5 miles from the ocean. It's much hotter. The conifers tend to run out. And across that land, stretching all the way to the Four Corners, down in the southwest, when the winds turn around, we get that weather. So it'll snow in the late spring, or it'll be triple digits when this happens during the summer. So these four environment ecologies, they all meet at the ranch. So that's what really is the foundation of the challenge of trying to farm there. So eventually we just stopped using these consultants because as experienced and well-meaning as they were, it was sort of like prescribing a formula for a classroom of kids and totally ignoring the individuals in the room. So we were an individual, And Ted Lemon once, we had a seminar at one of the Pinot Noir events, and he said that in his experience, which includes being a winemaker in Burgundy, and making Cabernet as well as Chardonnay and Pinot, that Hirsch was the most difficult place to farm that he had come across. So it really is a challenge there.
That indeed. Let's do a hypothetical. Let's pick you up and move you to Burgundy, and now suddenly you're a grape grower and winemaker in Romani-Conti, and we'll take Monsieur Viognier and move him out to West County. I know, Jeff. You give me the. So the wines.
Hey, Aubert married a Californian. Why not?
Right. So now, are you the wines that you're going to make in Burgundy and the wines he's going to make at Hirsch? Are they going to taste the same? What's going to happen?
Oh no, I mean they're not going to taste. You mean I'm going to make California Pinot in Burgundy?
No, you can do whatever you want in Burgundy. There you are. You've got the land, you've got the grapes, you've got the winemaking facilities, and suddenly he's got your grapes and your winemaking facility.
Well, I think he would be excited to be liberated from the AOC requirements. I mean, he could breathe. And of course the reverse would be applicable. Now that's great. That's a wonderful question. See, the thing that excited me about Burgundy was it's sort of a macrocosm of us. I mean, we have village wine sites, we have premier cru sites, we have Grand Cru sites, all within this 70 acres of vines that we have. And so I get to farm, and Jasmine gets to make wines from all of Burgundy, so to speak, overlaid on Hirsch vineyards. And I remember, I mean, in my own cellar, I can open a bottle from Volnay and just be ecstatic. And then a week later have some Chambolle, which is really kind of like the other side of the moon from Volnay. And, and be, wow, this is so amazing, like the intensity here. So, to be plopped down into Vosne Romani and, be saddled with just making those wines. Oh God,
I hear you.
No, they're extraordinary. But if you look at Romani Conti and you look at all the expressions coming out of that vineyard, it's pretty impressive. I don't mean just about the quality, but how they've over the years been able to learn about the finesse, the fine differences from one of the plots to the other plots. So La Tâche and Echizeau, like they really have integrity. It's not a marketing game. They're real characters. Yeah, that'd be interesting. Yeah, I'm gonna write to Robert and see him.
Yeah, he'd love to do that. Well, as we move to this last wine, just some general questions as you're pouring. General questions. Have you been worried about the fires?
Have I been worried about the fires?
Well, that's all we hear about back here in Houston is
yeah.
how the whole state's burning down.
Our whole place burned in 54. Matter of fact, that's how we got the building for the winery. There was a terrible fire, came up from the coast, burned this whole country where I am in 54, and that's the last fire we've had. And when we woke up Monday morning in October 2017, I think it was October 6th, and my wife's a yoga teacher, and she was going to Healdsburg to teach yoga that morning, and her colleague had called and said, "Don't come to Healdsburg." And we found out about the Tubbs fire burning across 101 into Santa Rosa. And the first thing I thought is, it should be here. You know, and it's funny, just to show how repetitive these things are, a neighbor of mine told me that he fought the same fire that burned from Calistoga down to Santa Rosa in 1956 or something like that. He's a logger in 54. Yeah, he was a cat skinner. And he said, I was out there for 3 days fighting that fire. But he said there were no subdivisions. There was just ranches and open land, so there was no, material destruction and loss of life. But yeah, we're spending a lot of money now, opening space around all the structures in the vineyards, having tree climber come in and cut low-lying limbs off, and we're really, really conscious about it. But we've got so many other issues that it's not I don't think anybody really worries about it too much. I'll tell you an interesting story, though, about these fires. This is a great tale. We have 16 guys that come up from Mexico under the seasonal agricultural work program, and a lot of them have been coming for years. And they've all been taught how to deal with fires when they start. That's the secret of a fire. If you catch it when it's starting, you got a prayer. It's when the wind comes up and all of a sudden it takes off. That's when you got real problems. So one day, the vineyard manager and his son are off in Cazadero, and when he's gone, nobody works. But there was one guy spraying on a tractor, and this is in April, and I think we had 90 inches of rain that year. And it's on a place where there's no house. We looked into it. No trespasser had come by, and a fire started. And fortunately, Rosalino was tractoring in that field next to it, and called the Everardo, the vineyard manager. Fortunately, got him. And Everardo called the bunkhouse, rousted out these 16 guys who had all been trained. They ran over to the shop, got the trucks, got their firefighting equipment, and put this thing out in half an hour. It's 2 or 3 acre fire. And it was the weirdest thing that we looked at each other and said, if we tried to start a fire there, it would take an hour and a lot of flammable material. We have no idea how this thing got started. But the news was, because we're thinking about it and we're prepared, these unsupervised guys put it out. Isn't that beautiful? Yeah. But you have to be prepared. Yeah.
Well, moving to this last one, I nosed that. I just thought about In Pursuit of Balance. I think that was a great thing that you got going. Maybe you could tell us what that was, and I think this is a classic example of Pursuit of Balance.
Pursuit of Balance was an event and organization that I started together with our dear family friend Ralph Carr, who is now my teacher, but was a long-time sommelier and amazing advocate for many wines of the world, particularly Burgundy. He's been on the cover of the Wine Spectator, and has been was a real person who I would share ideas with when I started listening to my father about California cinema, coming from having spent a lot of time facing Burgundy, entering the world of California cinema, trying to understand it and why it was different. God was really the person who helped me do that. And this question of why is California Pinot Noir so different from Burgundy? Raj said, well, okay, but there's examples like Literati, like Avant Dumont, like Calera, who actually are really making a more balanced style. And out of that conversation came this idea to put everything in a room together, all these ingredients in a room together. We started in 2011, ended up started in San Francisco, really literally wrote down winery names on the back of the napkin at the bar, kind of all around the world, and that's really beautiful and had a wonderful reception here. But the idea was to really showcase another side to California being wildlife. And I think it's been this, it was on the coattails of this incredible explosion of different styles in American wine. And why is that possible? It's possible because you as drinkers are really ready to say, I want this. You don't need Mr. Parker to tell you what to drink. People have really become much more self-confident in their own drinking. And also there's an incredible explosion of sources of information about wine. I mean, I'm looking at Christian right now and thinking, whose opinion do you care about more? Parker's or this guy right here? I mean, for me, this guy. So it's like now we have so many different people that we can talk to, and then that leads to us as producers being able to make the style of wine that we really believe in. We know there's going to be advocates out there who will tell you guys about us. You guys are kind of self-confident to follow the styles that we love. And so that's kind of what In Pursuit of Balance is about. But I will say that this wine honestly has nothing to do with style. It's this way because of the vineyard. This is the vineyard that was planted to those Mount Eden vines that Dad took in '89 and had virus. This vineyard can only be this way. It's always this really delicate, transparent. It's light. I mean, let's acknowledge that it's light, but it is so remarkably persistent on the palate. And for me, that is one of the sides of Pinot Noir that is so beautiful. I mean, it seduces with mystery, not with power.
We're getting near the end. We're not quite there. Let's talk about the future. This is a crazy question. The Reynolds Tobacco Company has been buying up a lot of vineyards, the Corbel properties, I think, in Russian River Valley. Is marijuana going to replace grapes as the primary crop in Sonoma County 20 years from now?
Well, not unless the government gets the heck out of it. They're just squelching it. Benziger. Mike Benziger is really had been a very serious biodynamic farmer at Benziger Wines in Glen Ellen. And I guess, I'm not privy to it, but the family made a decision to sell out. And so Mike took up marijuana growing, and total legally. And I met him for lunch a year or two ago, and I said, how's it going? And he said, well, it's driving me crazy because I can't hire anybody. If I hire somebody, I fall under so many rules and regulations that it's impossible. So I guess he has a small plot and he's just doing it himself. And, one of the problems with the future of our industry is that when I pointed out how inexpensive this sheep ranch was, 42 years ago, young people, and there are so many talented young wine makers who are all thirsting to get control of the growing, and the price of land is just too high, or the zoning and development restrictions are too intense for these people to get involved in the basement, which is where, as Jasmine pointed out, it all starts. So, it's kind of an issue. I don't know. Some of these talented young winemakers are able to influence landowners to either plant vineyards to their specification or existing vineyards that they would take over the farming. But it's really a big difference between being the steward of that land, having title to that land where you can really, as I've tried to relate to you, get married to it, become tied to it in a total way. So, yeah, the future is, the future will let us know what it's going to be. So,
yeah, GMO has come to so many other major agricultural crops. Do you think the people at Davis are going to introduce genetically modified vines soon?
I don't read the Davis Daily Worker, but I'm not. I bet you there's some secret lab there that they're working on. I hate to pick on poor Davis, but there's like 3 of these major universities: Germany, France, and America, and like they're sort of like doing to. Their tendency is to create a class of winemakers and wine growers, analogous to what Jasmine said about what high alcohol does to wine. They're homogenizing it. Sort of like what we discovered with our consultants. It's so generic, it's so technically driven, and there's such a reliance on that toolbox, of practices, techniques, and it's not like you don't want to use those tools, but they should only be used, if the site and the wine you're making require them, and you shouldn't be locked into, you shouldn't become addicted to them. It shouldn't be the tail wagging the dog. As a matter of fact, the better image of that, remember the old fairy tale of the Sorcerer's Apprentice? The magic broom, where the apprentice learns how to start the broom, and that mops the floors, and then all of a sudden the place starts getting flooded, and then he realized then he didn't know how to turn the broom off, the mop off, and the place all got flooded until the sorcerer came back and told him how to turn it off. So I think these are one of these examples where technology is so wonderful, but it has to serve us. We can't fall into the trap of winding up serving it. Anyway.
Yeah. Any questions?
Well, then, does that beg the question on yeast? Because UC Davis has got its yeast, and then there's natural yeast. Do you use natural yeast on all your wines?
Oh yeah. Actually, now you've asked the perfect question, because in the real world, the only winemaker is the yeast.
Correct.
Really, everything else is an embellishment. I mean, there were some amazing wines made and still being made by people who have no idea what this technology all is. And some of these wines have survived for 100 years. What did they know in Bordeaux? And
But if you talk to anybody from UC Davis, they think their yeast is the best yeast, and it's homogenized, and it's going to be.
Yeah, I know. It's but it kind of goes back to what I was trying to say about life. Especially now with what we're facing in our environment with this virus. Yeah, you want to sanitize, but you don't want to become sanitized. You know what I'm saying? No, yeah, let's wash our hands and and maybe our seat and all that. But I remember the Purcell company that makes all those sterilizing Perel, and the owner. This is like 20 years ago, way before this thing. And I remember reading an interview with the guy. He said, we were just a little family operation in Ohio, and all of a sudden he said, I can't believe the business we're getting. What's wrong with these people? Yeah. No, so it's really, you got to be discreet. It's really the test.
This is
Jim?
rather a valued question, but you mix your blocks. I know that you grow your blocks and you finesse your block, but do you mix your block in any of your wines?
Oh, sure, yeah.
Okay.
Oh, that's what the purpose of the San Andreas. That's always my favorite, because in any given vintage, that's the one that gives the story of what happened that year, because it's like 30 different blocks go in there. Yeah. But it's a big blending issue. It's an enormous challenge.
David, do you have a most memorable wine experience with a particular bottle?
Oh, You know, I did, but I forget so much stuff now. You know, it's kind of like my first kiss. You know, I can remember the kiss, but I can't put a name on it. But it was a Burgundy, I'll tell you that. Yeah.
Well, the bewitching hour is upon us. David, you're a most unusual individual. You've combined practicality and intellectual pursuit that most of us envy to be. We really admire you and appreciate you taking the time to come on down here to the flatlands. You know, we don't want the hills to get in the way of the clouds here. So, but we really look forward to a great future with Hirsch. You've got it, and thank you once again.
Well, thank you.